We're continuing our beginner series by zooming into the fantasy genre of literature and examining its various parts. There are a lot of people that have said they don't like fantasy because they have tried a book or two in the genre and didn't like them. That is kind of like saying you don't like Italian food because you had a bad lasagna once. Have you ever tried fettuccine alfredo? What about bruschetta? Have you even ever had a pizza? In this video, we're going to be looking at the subgenres of fantasy. It's kind of the smaller parts that make up the larger category that is fantasy literature. Now, there is no list. This is not exclusive, and this is not conclusive. The list goes on and on. This video could take forever, but we're just going to examine a few of the key genres here today. And there is no hard and fast rule. A lot of the subgenres kind of blend together, and there are books that borrow from one or two or more of various subgenres. So I might suggest a book being in one subgenre when you're like, no, that's in another one. Well, maybe they're in both, or maybe my definition of a subgenre is slightly different than yours. But this is my video, so I'm going to share with you what I think are some quick and easy descriptions for various subgenres, and then give you a book or two that might fall into that category. We're going to start all the way at the top with this one and explore the subgenre called high fantasy. Now, this is an entirely fictional world. Of course, there's going to be elements of our world that you're going to recognize in these stories. I mean, trees, water, sky, sun. Like, there's going to be some things that are familiar, but a lot of it's going to be unfamiliar. There's probably going to be an obvious magic to the world, maybe even an elaborate magic system. And then there's going to be creatures that you are unfamiliar with or that we don't have here on Earth, thankfully. Well, so there might be unicorns, there might be dragons, there might be orcs or goblins or any other kind of these fantastical creatures. Now, having creatures like that alone doesn't make a high fantasy novel, but they're often found in high fantasy novels because the universe and the world in which they are set is completely different than ours. Historically, these have often been set in European settings, so think like castle, moat, knight on a horse type situation. But thankfully, in recent years, there have been many authors that have been writing these high fantasy novels in various cultures or to depict various cultures, and it's kind of a breath of fresh air. So you're not just going to see knight, horse, castle. You're going to see all different kinds of cultures represented here in high fantasy. Books that might fall into the high fantasy category are like Lord of the Rings trilogy, as well as the Mistborn trilogy. Those are considered high fantasy. Next up, we've got epic fantasy. A lot of people would probably combine high and epic fantasy, saying they're one and the same. I'm going to separate them and say that epic is probably like an expansion of high fantasy. They share a lot of traits, have a lot in common, but epic fantasy has a wide cast of characters. You're probably not just going to be following one. You might have multiple points of views, sometimes upwards of 6, 7, or 8 different characters that you're seeing through their eyes. These books are often longer, and the series is often more epic in just length. It's typically not just a trilogy, although it can be, but there are many epic series that are ongoing, 10, 12, 15, 20 or more books in a series. But I don't mean to convey that just the length means that it becomes then epic fantasy. I think it's really the breadth of the story that is being told. It's often a clash of many kingdoms, and it's not just a length of story, but also the length of the saga that is being told. When I think epic fantasy, I think A Song of Ice and Fire, I think A Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, and my personal favorite is The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. If you've got high fantasy, you've got to have our third subgenre, which is low fantasy. This is a fantasy story primarily set in our world. You're going to see many things, most things that are completely familiar to you. It might even be set in your own backyard. This is fantastical elements, but in the real world, in reality. Most of us are completely aware of Harry Potter and that entire series. It's set in like a kind of a modern day. We're familiar with everything, but they just go to a different part of the world that muggles, humans can't see. That is an example of low fantasy. Next up, we've got heroic fantasy or sword and shield fantasy. I'm going to kind of lump these two together, although they might have some differences. This is similar to high fantasy, often set in similar settings, but this typically follows the story of one character, and it is all about their journey. It might not be like here's a beginning, middle, and end, but really here's the story of a hero of a person becoming a hero. Typically, there's a lot of swordplay or just a lot of action in general, and a lot of times it's mixed with romance as well. You've got to think like Conan the Barbarian, kind of like bare-chested. He's on a mission, he's becoming the hero. That is what people talk about when they talk about heroic fantasy. But it's not just Conan the Barbarian. You can maybe think of the Arthurian legends, those tales that are told of Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, some of those stories, or even The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. That is another story of a single character's journey into becoming a hero. And then we've got contemporary/urban fantasy. This is similar to low fantasy. In fact, there's a lot of qualities and characteristics that are the same here. This is a fantasy set in an urban environment. Sometimes it's present day, sometimes it's very modern. You're going to find guns here, gunpowder. You're going to find cars, computers, pop culture references, and the like. For whatever reason, a lot of the times these are mystery stories, or the magic is a little bit darker, like occult-like magic, or just supernatural elements set in a place like Chicago. A couple of stories that I consider to be contemporary/urban fantasy are The Dresden Files, or even Ninth House. And then we have alternate history. It's kind of exactly what it sounds like, in that it is fantasy set in a historical period of time in our real world. It can have high or low magic systems. It's not as much that it's focused on the fantasy magical part as it is focused on like a historical part. So we're back in time, probably not time travel, but we're back in time, and the story is being told in a setting that you can probably find in your history books, or at least based on one of those kinds of settings. Two books that I would consider to be in this category are The Poppy War and The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. Dickelodeon. Wow! Next up is the subgenre known as steampunk. You might also find this in science fiction as well, which we'll talk about in the next video in this series. But for fantasy, this incorporates technology in a significant way in a fantasy setting. Oftentimes, this is steam-powered machines laced with magic. Typically, these are set in industrial time periods, and for whatever reason, they are often in London. But think airships, clockwork devices, you might even have some gunpowder and stuff like that, but it is, again, there's going to be some fantastical, not only just fantastical, but even some magical elements that are a part of this world. So think of Sinlin Ascends and the Babel series, or even Mortal Engines. Those are two options for steampunk fantasy. Grimdark is our next subgenre, and this is probably the newest subgenre to be defined on this list, but it is increasing in popularity recently. This is often a high fantasy setting, but with a more grim setting and dark characters. Grim setting, dark characters, grimdark. Do you see how that works? Oftentimes here we'll have our protagonists be anti-heroes, meaning they're not pure, they're not perfect, and they're honestly not that good. All throughout these stories, you're going to find characters with ambiguous morals that are making decisions not only that you wouldn't make, but that you would most certainly not make, that you would run away from as a hero. And as in most stories that the authors historically want us to connect to those characters, wouldn't put them in these situations or have them make these decisions. Well, Grimdark jumps right in and has the characters that we're supposed to be identifying with and enjoying and liking and reading make some pretty terrible decisions. In other words, the good guys aren't role models. You're also probably going to get a lot of dark scenes here, like the murder's not going to be happening off the page. It's going to be happening right there. You're going to read it all in detail. Same with like sexy times and all the other things. I mean, it's grim dark for a reason. The Blade itself and the rest of the First Law series by Lord Grimdark himself is an option here, or also The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. Both of those definitely fall into the Grimdark territory. And then I wanted to conclude by simply saying that you've got blended genres that fall into fantasy. So this is when it's heavy science and heavy fantasy becoming science fantasy. This is when you've got a heavy romance story, but it's also got some fantastical elements. So you've got a fantasy romance or even a fantasy mystery for those kinds of stories. When it's not particularly one genre or another, but it includes fantasy, then you can find so many books that blend two different genres and are found here in this catch-all category. Again, I couldn't possibly include all of the subgenres here. If there are any key subgenres that you think that I missed, please let me know in the comments down below. Or if you know of any key titles that fall in any of these genres that you think are defining titles for that subgenre, please let me know that in the comments down below as well. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch and like this video. If you haven't yet, click subscribe and join the Dragon Army, and we'll see you in the next video.